Sometimes love finds you when you least expect it, in the most unlikely places. Sometimes it takes a stranger's gentle hands to show you what your heart has been missing all along. Margaret Whitmore had everything money could buy on her Montana ranch, but she couldn't buy what she needed most. Someone who truly understood the weight of caring for her disabled son, Thomas. Then one day, a quiet mountain man named Samuel Ridge appeared at her door, offering help without asking for anything in return. When Margaret found him tenderly caring for her boy, she realized that beneath his rough exterior lived the gentlest soul she'd ever known. But could a wealthy widow and a simple mountain man find common ground in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore ranch, its golden light painting the rolling pastures in shades of amber and green that stretched toward the distant Montana peaks. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the hired hands move about their tasks with practiced efficiency. At 38, she still possessed the refined beauty that had once turned heads in Denver's social circles, though now her auburn hair was often pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands bore the calluses of ranch work her late husband, Charles, would never have expected her to learn. 3 years had passed since Charles's unexpected heart attack had left her alone with their 8-year-old son Thomas, and a ranch operation worth more than most small towns. The W Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, supporting nearly 2,000 head of cattle and employing a dozen full-time hands. By any measure, Margaret had managed the transition from grieving widow to capable ranch owner with remarkable success. The books balanced, the cattle thrived, and the bank account remained healthy enough to weather any storm. Yet standing in her spacious kitchen, with its imported marble countertops and hand-carved cabinets, Margaret felt the familiar weight of isolation settle over her shoulders, like a winter coat she couldn't remove. The house, built to Charles's exacting standards, boasted 12 rooms filled with the finest furnishings money could provide. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, oil paintings adorned the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across rooms that echoed with too much space and too little laughter. "Mama," Thomas's voice drifted from the parlor, soft and uncertain as it had been since the fever that had damaged his mind 2 years prior. Before the illness, he had been a bright, energetic child who could recite poetry and solve arithmetic, problems that challenged children twice his age. Now, at 11, Thomas possessed the intellectual capacity of a much younger child, his speech often halting and his movements unsteady. The doctors in Denver had used clinical terms like cognitive impairment and developmental delays, but Margaret had learned that such words meant little when measured against a mother's love and determination. "Coming, sweetheart," she called, untying her apron and smoothing her blue calico dress. She found Thomas sitting in his favorite spot by the tall windows that faced the western pastures, his thin fingers clutching the silver music box that had been his father's final gift. The delicate mechanism played a haunting melody when wound, and Thomas would listen with rapt attention, as if the notes contained secrets only he could understand. "The music stopped," he said, his dark eyes so like Charles's, looking up at her with trust that never failed to break her heart and mend it simultaneously. Margaret settled beside him on the velvet cushions, taking the music box in her gentle hands. The artifact had become Thomas's most treasured possession, a tangible connection to the father he remembered in fragments and dreams. She wound the key carefully, and the tinkling melody filled the air once more. "There," she murmured, watching his face light up with pure joy. "Better?" Thomas nodded, leaning against her shoulder with the easy affection that reminded her why every sacrifice felt worthwhile. Outside the window, the ranch hands moved about their duties, and Margaret recognized the familiar rhythm of a well-ordered operation. Tom Bradley, her foreman, had worked for Charles since before their marriage, and now served as her most trusted advisor. At 62, he possessed an innate understanding of cattle and land that no amount of book learning could match. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the housekeeper who had managed the domestic staff for nearly a decade, appeared in the doorway with her usual quiet efficiency. A widow herself, Eleanor understood the particular challenges Margaret faced, though she rarely spoke of personal matters. Her greying hair was always perfectly arranged, and her black dress maintained the standards of propriety that Charles had expected. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor said in her measured tone, "Dr. Harrison has arrived for Thomas's weekly examination." Margaret felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied these medical visits. Dr. Benjamin Harrison had travelled from Helena monthly since Thomas's illness, monitoring his condition with the dedication of a family friend rather than merely a physician. A distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, he had known Thomas before the fever and refused to give up hope for improvement. "Come along, darling," Margaret said to Thomas, who immediately clutched the music box tighter to his chest. The examination took place in Charles's former study, now converted into a makeshift medical room with better lighting and comfortable seating. Dr. Harrison's approach with Thomas remained consistently gentle, speaking to him as an individual rather than a patient, asking about his interests and listening to his sometimes rambling responses with genuine attention. His motor coordination continues to improve, Dr. Harrison observed quietly to Margaret as Thomas played with wooden blocks near the window. "The speech therapy exercises you've been doing are helping. I can hear more clarity in his pronunciation." Margaret nodded, though the progress felt agonizingly slow. "He still becomes confused easily, especially with new situations or unfamiliar people. That's not uncommon with this type of injury," the doctor assured her. "The brain finds ways to compensate, but it takes time. You're providing him with exactly what he needs: consistency, love, and patient encouragement." After Dr. Harrison departed, promising to return in 2 weeks rather than 4 due to Thomas's recent improvements, Margaret helped her son with his afternoon lessons. They worked through simple arithmetic and reading exercises, Thomas's concentration wavering, but his effort never diminishing. His determination to please her touched something deep in Margaret's chest, a mixture of pride and protective fieriness that had grown stronger since Charles's death. The afternoon brought visitors in the form of Reverend Samuel Matthews and his wife Catherine from the nearby town of Millfield. The couple had maintained their friendship with Margaret, despite the social awkwardness that sometimes accompanied visits to a widow's home. Reverend Matthews, a thoughtful man in his 40s, had officiated at Charles's funeral and continued to provide spiritual guidance when Margaret requested it. "You look well, Margaret," Catherine observed over tea served in the china Charles had imported from England. "Though I hope you're not working yourself too hard managing everything alone." The comment, though kindly meant, touched on the persistent concern that seemed to underlie every social interaction Margaret experienced. The unspoken assumption that a woman, even one with considerable resources, could not indefinitely manage such responsibilities without masculine guidance. The suggestion of remarriage hovered in conversations like smoke, never directly addressed but always present. "The ranch runs smoothly," Margaret replied diplomatically. "Tom Bradley's experience is invaluable, and the hands are reliable." "Of course," Reverend Matthews interjected, "but there are other considerations. Thomas would benefit from having a father figure, someone who could provide guidance as he grows older." Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The suggestion that Thomas required more than her love and dedication rankled, though she understood it came from genuine concern rather than criticism. "Thomas has all the guidance he needs," she said firmly. "Dr. Harrison believes his progress is encouraging." The conversation shifted to safer topics, the weather, crop prospects, news from town, but Margaret remained aware of the underlying current of well-meaning interference that seemed to accompany most social interactions. The isolation she felt wasn't merely physical, it was the loneliness of making every decision alone, of bearing every responsibility without partnership, of facing each day's challenges with only her own judgment to rely upon. After the visitors departed, Margaret stood on the wide front porch that Charles had designed to showcase the ranch's commanding view of the surrounding valley. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that never failed to remind her why Charles had chosen this particular spot to build their home. The beauty remained, but it felt hollow without someone to share it with, without adult conversation that extended beyond business necessities or polite social obligations. Thomas appeared beside her, his music box silent now, but still clutched in his hands. "Mama, why don't the people stay longer?" The question, asked with the direct honesty that characterized his current mental state, pierced through Margaret's careful composure. "What do you mean, sweetheart? They come and drink tea and talk, but then they leave. In the old house, people stayed for dinner and played games. Why don't they do that anymore?" Margaret knelt to his level, studying his earnest face. Thomas remembered fragments of their previous life in town, when Charles's business associates and their social circle had provided regular entertainment and companionship. The move to the ranch had been intended as a temporary retreat after Thomas's illness, a chance for healing in peaceful surroundings, but somehow temporary had become permanent. Isolation had become habit, and the healing they had sought remained elusive. "Things are different now," she said carefully, unwilling to burden him with explanations he couldn't fully understand. "I miss people staying," Thomas said simply, leaning against her with the unconscious trust that reminded her daily why every sacrifice felt worthwhile. "The house is too quiet." That evening, after Thomas had been settled for the night with his music box on the bedside table, Margaret sat in Charles's former chair in the study, reviewing ranch accounts by lamplight. The numbers told a story of prosperity and careful management, but they couldn't address the growing restlessness in her heart. At 38, she felt caught between worlds, too young to resign herself to permanent widowhood, too protective of Thomas to risk the complications that new relationships might bring, too proud to admit that managing everything alone had begun to feel overwhelming. The sound of horses approaching the house broke her concentration. Tom Bradley's voice carried through the evening air, speaking to someone she didn't recognize. Margaret moved to the window and saw her foreman standing near the barn, with a tall figure she couldn't make out clearly in the gathering darkness. Stranger on the ranch wasn't unusual. Drifters sometimes sought temporary work, and neighboring ranchers occasionally stopped by to discuss shared concerns. But something about the visitor's posture, the way he stood with quiet confidence rather than the deference most temporary workers displayed, caught her attention. She watched as Tom gestured toward the bunkhouse, apparently offering accommodation for the night. The stranger nodded, shouldering what appeared to be a well-worn pack, and followed Tom toward the outbuildings. In the brief moment when they passed through the circle of light cast by the barn's lantern, Margaret caught a glimpse of a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, the silhouette of a man who moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin. The encounter meant nothing significant. Ranch business often brought strangers to the Double W, but as Margaret returned to her account books, she found herself wondering about the visitor. Something in his bearing had suggested competence and reliability, qualities that were always welcome in temporary help. She dismissed the thought and returned to her work, unaware that the stranger's arrival would prove to be far more significant than either of them could have imagined. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines that bordered the ranch, carrying with it the promise of changes that neither Margaret's careful planning nor her protective instincts could prevent. Victor. Music box on Thomas's nightstand played its lonely melody one final time before winding down. And in the silence that followed, the Double W Ranch settled into another night of waiting, though waiting for what, Margaret could not yet say. The next morning brought Samuel Ridge into Margaret's life with the quiet inevitability of sunrise. She first saw him properly as she stepped onto the porch with her morning coffee, the steam rising from her cup in the crisp September air. He stood near the corral with Tom Bradley, and in the clear light of day, Margaret could assess what darkness had only hinted at the night before. Samuel was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the lean, weathered build of a man who had spent his life outdoors. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the deep tan and fine lines that spoke of countless days under mountain sun. He wore simple clothes, brown wool pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen considerable use, but everything about him suggested competence and quiet strength. "Ma'am," Tom called, noticing her presence. "This here's Samuel Ridge. He's looking for work, and I thought you might want to meet him yourself." Samuel removed his hat as he approached the porch, revealing hair that was thick despite his apparent age, which Margaret guessed to be somewhere in his early 40s. His eyes, she noticed, were the deep blue-grey of winter sky, and they held a directness that was neither challenging nor deferential. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "I'm grateful for the hospitality last night. Tom says you might have use for an extra hand." Margaret studied him, aware that her assessment would determine whether he stayed or moved on. Something about Samuel Ridge suggested he was more than the typical drifter seeking temporary work. His bearing spoke of education and experience beyond what his simple clothes might indicate. "What kind of work are you experienced with?" she asked. "Most anything a ranch requires, ma'am. I've worked. Cattle, repaired fencing, broken horses. I can do carpentry, some blacksmith work. I'm not afraid of hard labor, and I learn quick if there's something I haven't done before." His response was straightforward, without being boastful, factual, without unnecessary elaboration. Margaret found herself appreciating the absence of the flowery promises that often accompanied job applications from men who seemed to think a widow would be easily impressed by bold claims. "Mr. Ridge," she began, then paused as Thomas appeared in the doorway behind her, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices. Her son moved slowly, clutching his music box, his eyes wide with the mixture of curiosity and uncertainty that new situations always provoked. Samuel's attention shifted to Thomas, and Margaret watched carefully for the reaction that would tell her everything she needed to know about this stranger's character. Too many people looked at her son with pity, discomfort, or poorly concealed impatience. Samuel did none of these things. Instead, he regarded Thomas with the same respectful attention he had given her. "Morning," Samuel said to Thomas, his voice gentling naturally without becoming condescending. "That's a fine music box you have there." Thomas looked to Margaret for permission before responding, a habit developed since his illness made social interactions more challenging. At her encouraging nod, he stepped forward slightly. "It plays songs," Thomas said carefully. "My papa gave it to me." "Music's important," Samuel replied seriously. "Makes the world a better place, I think." The simple acceptance in Samuel's response, the way he neither ignored Thomas nor treated him as fragile, struck Margaret with unexpected force. Here was a man who saw her son as a person rather than a condition, who spoke to him with natural respect rather than awkward sympathy. "Mr. Ridge," Margaret said, making her decision, "I can offer you room in the bunkhouse and meals with the hands. The pay is $30 a month plus found. That's generous, ma'am, I accept. Tom will show you what needs doing. We'll see how things work out." Samuel nodded, replaced his hat, and followed Tom toward the corral where several horses waited. And for breaking, Margaret watched them go, noting how Samuel moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with livestock. There was something about him that suggested depths beneath the surface, stories that wouldn't be told unless she proved worthy of hearing them. The morning proceeded normally until just before noon, when Thomas suffered one of his episodes. Margaret was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Patterson prepare lunch when she heard the crash from the parlor, followed by Thomas's distressed crying. She rushed to find him on the floor, beside the overturned side table, his music box scattered in pieces. Around him, "No, no, no," Thomas kept repeating, his hands fluttering helplessly over the broken mechanism. His face had taken on the pale, sweaty appearance that signaled the onset of one of his confusion spells, brought on by the shock of accidentally destroying his most precious possession. Margaret knelt beside him, gathering the pieces while trying to assess whether he had been injured in the fall. "It's all right, sweetheart. We can fix it. Everything's going to be fine." But Thomas was beyond hearing her reassurances. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, and his eyes held the unfocused quality that Dr. Harrison had explained often accompanied episodes of overstimulation in patients with Thomas's type of brain injury. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face creased with concern. "Shall I send for Dr. Harrison?" "Yes," Margaret said, though she knew the doctor was at least 2 hours away. "And tell Tom to—" "Ma'am?" Samuel's voice came from behind Mrs. Patterson, quiet but immediate. "Heard the commotion. Anything I can do to help?" Margaret looked up, about to dismiss his offer, when she saw that Samuel wasn't looking at her. His attention was entirely focused on Thomas, and his expression held none of the alarm or discomfort that usually characterized people's reactions to her son's episodes. "Thomas, isn't it?" Samuel said, lowering himself to sit cross-legged on the floor a few feet away from the distressed boy. His movement was slow and deliberate, designed not to startle. "I can see you're upset about your music box." Thomas's sobbing quieted slightly, though his breathing remained labored. "I know something about fixing things," Samuel continued in the same calm tone. "Music boxes are tricky, but not impossible. Mind if I take a look?" Without waiting for permission, Samuel began carefully gathering the scattered pieces, his large and surprisingly gentle as he examined each component. Margaret watched transfixed as her son's attention gradually focused on Samuel's actions. "See this spring here?" Samuel said, holding up a small metal coil. "That's what makes the music happen. It's not broken, just come loose. And this little gear," he showed Thomas a tiny brass wheel. "This one tells the spring how fast to turn. Everything important is still here." Thomas's breathing had begun to slow, his eyes following Samuel's careful examination of each piece. "Can you really fix it?" "Well," Samuel said thoughtfully, "I can try, but I might need an assistant, someone who knows this music box better than anyone else. Think you might be willing to help?" The transformation in Thomas was remarkable. His panic had subsided, replaced by cautious hope and growing fascination with Samuel's patient approach to the problem. Margaret found herself watching Samuel rather than her son, struck by the man's natural understanding of how to diffuse a crisis without drama or false promises. "Yes," Thomas whispered. "I want to help." "Good man," Samuel said seriously. "First thing we need is a clean cloth to wrap these. We're pieces in, so nothing gets lost. Think your mama might have something we could use?" For the next hour, Margaret observed something she had never seen before. Her son, working calmly and productively with a virtual stranger, completely absorbed in the delicate process of music box repair. Samuel's hands, which had appeared rough and work-hardened, proved capable of the finest manipulation as he explained each step to Thomas in terms the boy could understand. "The melody cylinder has tiny pins that pluck the teeth of this steel comb," Samuel explained, showing Thomas how the mechanism worked. "Each pin makes a different note, and when they're all working together, you get your song." Thomas nodded gravely, holding the cloth that contained the smaller pieces while Samuel worked with jeweler-like precision on the main mechanism. Mrs. Patterson had brought them tools from Charles's old workbench, and Samuel used them with the skill of someone who had done such repairs before. "There," Samuel said finally, winding the tiny key. The familiar melody began to play, perhaps not quite as smoothly as before, but recognizably the same tune that had comforted Thomas for years. Thomas's face blazed with joy as he carefully took the restored music box in his hands. "It works, Mama, it works!" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from relief at Thomas's happiness or amazement at Samuel's kindness, she couldn't say. "Thank you," she said to Samuel, the words feeling inadequate. Samuel stood, brushing dust from his knees, happy to help. Thomas did most of the real work. The simple deflection of credit, the way he made Thomas feel competent and useful rather than helpless, told Margaret more about Samuel Ridge's character than any letter of recommendation could have provided. This was a man who understood that dignity mattered as much as assistance, that helping someone meant building them up rather than taking over. "Mr. Ridge," she said carefully, "would you join us for lunch? I think we owe you a proper meal." Samuel hesitated, and Margaret sensed his awareness of the social boundaries that typically existed between ranch owners and hired hands. "That's kind, Mom, but not necessary." "It's necessary to me," Margaret said firmly. "Please." As they walked toward the dining room, Thomas chattering happily about his restored music box, Margaret found herself stealing glances at the man who had just provided her son with something she hadn't been able to give him: the experience of success, of being useful, of working alongside someone who treated him as capable rather than fragile. She had been managing the ranch successfully for 3 years, protecting Thomas from anything that might upset or confuse him, building a careful world where his limitations wouldn't cause him pain. In one morning, Samuel Ridge had shown her that perhaps protection wasn't the same as progress, that her son might be capable of more than she had allowed herself to believe. The realization was both hopeful and unsettling, a crack in the careful foundation of assumptions upon which she had built their isolated life. As she watched Samuel listen seriously to Thomas's rambling explanation of how the music box had been his father's gift, Margaret wondered what other assumptions might prove equally fragile. Outside the dining room windows, the autumn sun cast everything in golden light that seemed somehow brighter than it had that morning, as if Samuel's arrival had altered not just the day's events, but the very quality of light itself. Margaret spent the following days observing Samuel Ridge with the careful attention she had once reserved for evaluating potential business partners. In Charles's enterprises, the man who had so skillfully repaired Thomas's music box proved equally competent with every task Tom Bradley assigned him. He mended fence lines with methodical precision, gentled nervous horses with patient persistence, and approached each responsibility with the quiet thoroughness that marked true craftsmanship. More significantly, Samuel's presence seemed to draw Thomas out of the careful shell Margaret had built around him. Her son began appearing at the kitchen window each morning, watching for Samuel's emergence from the bunkhouse. When permitted, Thomas would follow at a respectful distance as Samuel went about his work, content to observe and occasionally ask questions that Samuel answered with serious consideration. "Mama," Thomas said one afternoon, as they sat in the parlor working through his arithmetic lessons, "Samuel says horses can tell if you're afraid." Margaret looked up from the slate where she had been demonstrating simple addition. "Does he? What else did Samuel tell you?" "He says animals know if you respect them or if you're just trying to boss them around. He says that's why some people are good with horses and some aren't." Thomas paused, his pencil poised over his work. "Do you think Samuel respects me?" The question, asked with the guileless directness that characterized Thomas's current mental state, caught Margaret off guard. She studied her son's earnest face, seeing in it both the innocence of childhood and the hard-won wisdom that sometimes emerged from suffering. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because he talks to me like Papa used to before I got sick. Like what I say matters." Margaret felt her throat tighten. Charles had indeed possessed a special gift for communicating with Thomas, a natural ability to engage their son's bright mind without condescension. Since Charles's death and Thomas's illness, Margaret had become so focused on protecting and caring for her son that she hadn't realized how much she missed seeing him treated as an individual with thoughts worth hearing. "I think Samuel does respect you," she said carefully. "I think he sees the same special person in you that Papa did." That evening, Margaret made an unprecedented decision. Instead of having Samuel take his meals with the ranch hands as was customary, she asked Mrs. Patterson to set a place for him at the family table. When Samuel appeared at the kitchen door at the appointed hour, she met him with a request rather than an invitation. "Mr. Ridge, I was hoping you might join Thomas and me for dinner. He's been asking about your work with the horses, and I thought perhaps you could tell us more about it." Samuel hesitated, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but it might not be proper. The other hands will think what I tell them to think," Margaret interrupted gently but firmly. "This is my table, and you're welcome at it." The dinner that followed proved revelatory in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Samuel possessed an easy, conversational manner that drew Thomas into discussions about ranch life, animal behavior, and the practical skills required to maintain a working operation. But more than that, he listened to Thomas's responses with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that encouraged the boy to expand his thoughts. "Thomas tells me he's learning arithmetic," Samuel said, as Mrs. Patterson served dessert. "That's important knowledge for ranch work. Lots of counting involved. Cattle, feed calculations, measuring fence lines." Thomas straightened in his chair, his face lighting up with interest. "Could I help count cattle?" "Well," Samuel said thoughtfully, "that would be up to your mother, but I don't see why not if she thinks you're ready for it." Margaret found herself considering the possibility for the first time. Since Thomas's illness, she had kept him close to the house, away from the potentially dangerous or confusing activities of the working ranch. But watching his eager response to Samuel's suggestion, she wondered whether her protective instincts had become too restrictive. "We could start small," she said carefully, "perhaps counting the horses in the near pasture." The joy that spread across Thomas's face was worth any risk such an activity might entail. For the first time in months, her son looked forward to something beyond his limited daily routine. After dinner, as they sat in the parlor with coffee and Thomas played quietly with his restored music box, Margaret found herself engaged in the kind of adult conversation she had missed more than she realized. Samuel proved to be well-read and thoughtful, capable of discussing topics ranging from current political developments to philosophical questions about the changing nature of the American frontier. "You've traveled extensively," Margaret observed, noting the breadth of his knowledge about different regions and their characteristics. "Some," Samuel acknowledged. "A man can learn a lot by keeping his eyes open and his mouth shut in new places." "What brought you to Montana?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Sometimes a man needs to find a place where the past doesn't follow him around like a persistent shadow." The response carried undertones of pain that Margaret recognized. She had felt something similar after Charles's death, the desire to escape reminders of loss, to find somewhere the weight of memory might feel lighter. Samuel's reluctance to elaborate suggested wounds that were still tender, and she respected his privacy too much to press for details. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Margaret's late husband's business journal, which she had retrieved from Charles's study to review some old cattle purchase records. As she spread the leather-bound volume on the kitchen table, Samuel appeared with Thomas, both of them dusty from an inspection of the barn's hay storage. "Mama, Samuel showed me how to tell good hay from bad hay," Thomas announced proudly. "You look for mold and count how many mice holes there are?" Margaret smiled at her son's enthusiasm while noting how naturally Samuel had included him in what might have been considered adult work. The journal lay open before her, Charles's careful handwriting documenting decisions and observations from years past. Samuel's attention was caught by the entries, and he studied them with obvious interest. "Your husband kept detailed records," he observed. Smart practice for an operation this size. Charles believed in documentation, Margaret replied. He said memory was unreliable, but written records told the truth. Mind if I ask what you're looking for? Margaret hesitated, then decided that Samuel's proven competence and growing involvement in ranch activities justified sharing information. I'm trying to trace the purchase history of our breeding stock. We're considering expanding the herd next spring, and I want to understand which bloodlines have performed best. Samuel nodded thoughtfully, then surprised her by pointing to a specific entry. This bull here, Sultan's Pride. Charles noted he was having problems with aggressive behavior toward the handlers. Margaret studied the entry Samuel had indicated. Yes, Charles had to sell him after he injured one of the hands. How did you know that? The name was familiar. I worked on the ranch that bought him, the Circle K spread over in Gallatin Valley. That bull never did settle down, had to be put down eventually after he went after the owner's son. The casual revelation that Samuel had personal knowledge of her husband's business decisions created an odd sensation in Margaret's chest, a mixture of comfort that Charles's judgment had been sound and unease at the unexpected connection between her past and present. You worked for the Kellys? She asked. For about 6 months, 3 years back, good people, but the ranch was struggling. Too much debt, not enough rain. Samuel paused, his expression growing thoughtful. They spoke highly of your husband's business sense, said he was fair in his dealings and kept his word. Margaret felt an unexpected warmth at this second-hand validation of Charles's character. He was a good man, she said simply. Thomas certainly seems to think so, Samuel replied, watching as the boy carefully turned the pages of his father's journal. He talks about him a lot, always with respect and love. The conversation might have continued, but Mrs. Patterson appeared with news that Dr. Harrison had arrived earlier than expected for Thomas's appointment. As Margaret prepared to accompany her son to the study, she found herself reluctant to end the easy familiarity that had developed during their discussion of the journal. Mr. Ridge, she said impulsively, would you mind waiting? I'd like to continue our conversation about the herd expansion after Thomas's examination. Samuel nodded, settling into a chair with the comfortable patience of a man accustomed to waiting. I'll be here, Ma'am. The examination went well. Dr. Harrison noted continued improvement in Thomas's coordination and attention span, but Margaret found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the kitchen, where Samuel waited. For the first time since Charles's death, she had found herself discussing ranch business with someone who understood both the practical and financial implications of her decisions. More than that, Samuel's connection to her husband's past dealings provided an unexpected bridge between the life she had lost and the life she was building. In sharing stories about Sultan's Pride and the Kelly Ranch, Samuel had given her a glimpse of Charles's reputation in the wider ranching community, a legacy of fairness and competence that she was working to uphold. When she returned to the kitchen, Samuel was exactly where she had left him, reading a farming periodical Mrs. Patterson had provided. His presence had already begun to feel natural, as if the kitchen's atmosphere had adjusted to accommodate him. Dr. Harrison says Thomas is making excellent progress, she reported, settling back at the table with the journal. That's good, too. Here, he's a bright boy, just needs the right kind of encouragement. The simple assessment, delivered without sentimentality or false optimism, somehow meant more to Margaret than the doctor's clinical observations. Samuel saw Thomas clearly, neither minimizing his challenges nor dwelling on his limitations. As they returned to their discussion of breeding stock and market trends, Margaret realized that something fundamental had shifted in her carefully ordered world. For the first time in 3 years, she was making decisions in consultation with someone whose judgment she was beginning to trust, not because she needed permission or approval, but because shared wisdom made better outcomes more likely. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen windows, illuminating Charles's journal and casting both of them in the warm glow of productive collaboration. Outside, Thomas's voice could be heard as he helped Mrs. Patterson hang laundry, his laughter carrying on the autumn breeze with a frequency Margaret hadn't heard since before his illness. Change, she reflected, didn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of a competent stranger who fixed music boxes and remembered difficult bulls, who treated damaged children with dignity and honored dead husbands' reputations with respect. As Samuel traced bloodlines through Charles's careful entries, Margaret found herself wondering what other changes might be approaching with the same quiet inevitability. The wooden horse appeared on Thomas's windowsill 3 weeks after Samuel's arrival, carved with such delicate precision that Margaret initially mistook it for a store-bought toy. The craftsmanship revealed itself upon closer inspection. Every detail, from the flowing mane to the carefully sculpted hooves, bore the marks of patient handwork, the kind of attention that spoke of hours spent in quiet concentration. "Samuel made it for me," Thomas announced proudly when Margaret discovered him cradling the figure during his morning lessons. "He said every boy should have a horse, even if it's only wood." Margaret examined the carving more closely, marveling at the skill required to create something so intricate from what appeared to be a simple piece of pine. The horse stood in a graceful pose, head raised as if responding to some distant sound, its expression alert and intelligent. Samuel had somehow captured the essence of life in an inanimate object. "When did he give this to you?" she asked. "Yesterday, after I helped him count the fence posts in the south pasture. He said I was getting good at numbers and deserved something special." The casual mention of Thomas's involvement in ranch work gave Margaret pause. Over the past weeks, she had noticed her son's increasing confidence and engagement, but she hadn't realized how extensively Samuel had been including him in his daily activities. The thought should have alarmed her. Thomas's safety had been her paramount concern since his illness, but instead she felt a growing recognition that her son was thriving under Samuel's gentle guidance. That evening, after Thomas had been settled for the night with his wooden horse placed carefully beside his music box, Margaret sought out Samuel in the barn, where he was tending to a mare with a minor injury. She found him applying a poultice to the animal's foreleg with the same careful attention he brought to all his tasks. "The horse you carved for Thomas is beautiful," she said without preamble. "Where did you learn such skill?" Samuel didn't look up from his work, but she saw his shoulders relax slightly. "Had a lot of quiet evenings over the years. Carvings, peaceful work. Keeps your hands busy while your mind sorts things out. It must have taken considerable time." "Time's one thing I've had plenty of," Samuel replied, finishing with the mare and giving her neck an affectionate pat. "Besides, Thomas earned it. He's been a real help with the counting work, better at staying focused than some grown men I've known." Margaret stepped closer, noting how the mare stood calmly under Samuel's ministrations, despite what must be painful inflammation. His touch with animals mirrored his approach with Thomas, gentle but confident, conveying reassurance through competence rather than empty comfort. "Samuel," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to express what she was thinking. "I want to thank you for the way you've treated Thomas. Since his illness, most people either ignore him or treat him like he's made of glass. You've found a middle ground I didn't know existed." Samuel straightened, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since she had entered the barn. In the lamplight, his face showed lines of fatigue and something deeper, a weariness that suggested he understood suffering in ways that went beyond physical hardship. "Thomas isn't broken, Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly. "He's just traveling. A different path than most folks. Doesn't mean he can't get where he's going, just means he might need different signposts along the way." The metaphor, delivered with Samuel's characteristic thoughtfulness, captured something Margaret had been struggling to articulate about her son's condition. Thomas wasn't diminished. He was different, and difference required adaptation rather than limitation. You speak as though you have experience with such things, she observed. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on organizing his veterinary supplies. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone sharing information that still caused pain. "I had a brother," he said finally, "born with what the doctors called a weak mind, though there wasn't anything weak about his heart. Danny was the gentlest soul I ever knew. Couldn't harm a fly, but could gentle a spooked horse or calm a crying baby like he had some kind of magic." Margaret waited, sensing that Samuel was sharing something he rarely discussed. "Lost him in the war," Samuel continued, "not to enemy fire, to fear and ignorance. Some of the other soldiers thought his simple ways made him a liability. They were wrong, but by the time I could prove it, it was too late." The revelation explained much about Samuel's natural understanding of Thomas's needs, his patient approach to communication, and his instinctive rejection of the assumption that cognitive differences meant lesser worth. He had loved someone like Thomas, had lost someone like Thomas, and had learned lessons that most people never had the opportunity or motivation to acquire. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, the words feeling inadequate. "Don't be sorry for me," Samuel replied, his voice growing firm. "Be grateful for Thomas. Every day with someone like him is a gift, even when, especially when, the world doesn't see it that way." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, the barn filled with the quiet sounds of animals settling for the night. Margaret found herself seeing Samuel with new clarity, not just as a competent ranch hand who happened to be kind to her son, but as a man who had suffered profound loss and emerged with deeper wisdom rather than bitter cynicism. "Would you join us for dinner tomorrow?" she asked impulsively. "I'm planning to cook something special for Thomas's birthday next week, and I thought we might have a practice run." Samuel smiled, the first truly unguarded expression she had seen from him. "I'd be honored, Ma'am." The following evening's dinner proved to be a revelation in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Samuel arrived carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to Thomas with appropriate ceremony. "Early birthday present," he explained, as Thomas carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a set of wooden animals, a cow, a pig, a sheep, and a chicken, each carved with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the horse. Thomas's delight was immediate and profound, and he spent several minutes examining each figure before carefully arranging them in a miniature farmyard on the table beside his plate. "They're perfect," Thomas breathed. "Now my horse has friends." "Every good horse needs a herd," Samuel agreed seriously, "and every good ranch needs different kinds of animals working together." As dinner progressed, Margaret found herself drawn into conversation that ranged from practical ranch matters to more philosophical discussions about life on the frontier. Samuel possessed a depth of knowledge that suggested formal education, though he wore his learning lightly, never displaying it for effect. "You mentioned losing your brother in the war," she said during a lull in the conversation. "Were you in the military long?" "4 years," Samuel replied. "Signed up thinking it would be an adventure. Learned pretty quick that war's got nothing to do with adventure and everything to do with endurance." "What did you do after the war?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, his expression growing distant. "I tried to go home, but home wasn't there anymore. Family farm had been sold for taxes, parents both dead from fever. Danny was all I had left, and when I lost him," he shrugged, "seemed like the best thing was to keep moving." "For how long?" Margaret asked gently. "Going on 15 years now, worked ranches from Texas to Montana, always moving when the restlessness got too strong or the memories got too clear." The picture that emerged was of a man who had been adrift for a decade and a half, carrying grief and guilt that kept him from settling anywhere long enough to build new connections. Margaret understood something about that kind of rootlessness. She had felt it herself after Charles's death, the sense that staying in one place meant confronting losses too painful to bear. "And now?" she asked. Samuel looked around the comfortable dining room. his gaze taking in the family portraits, the well-tended furniture, the sense of permanence and care that permeated the space. His eyes lingered on Thomas, who was quietly playing with his wooden animals, creating elaborate scenarios involving their imaginary adventures. "Now I'm thinking maybe it's time to stop running," he said quietly. The admission hung in the air. Between them, weighted with implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine directly. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, recognizing in Samuel's words an echo of her own growing desire for something beyond the careful isolation she had maintained since Charles's death. After dinner, as they sat in the parlor with coffee and Thomas demonstrated the proper care and feeding of wooden livestock, Margaret found herself studying Samuel's profile in the lamplight. He had the kind of face that improved with closer acquaintance, not conventionally handsome, but marked by character and intelligence that made superficial attractiveness seem irrelevant. "Samuel," Thomas said suddenly, looking up from his play, "are you going to stay here forever?" The question, asked with the directness that characterized Thomas's communication style, caught both adults off guard. Samuel glanced at Margaret before responding, and she saw in his expression the same uncertainty she felt about the future. "I don't know about forever," Samuel said carefully, "but I'm not planning to leave any time soon, if that's what you're worried about." "Good," Thomas replied with satisfaction. "I like having you here. Mama smiles more when you're around." The faux observation, delivered with the unfiltered honesty that was both blessing and challenge of Thomas's condition, caused Margaret to flush with embarrassment. Samuel, however, seemed more pleased than discomfited by the revelation. "Your mama has a nice smile," he agreed solemnly. "Seems like something worth encouraging." Later, as Margaret walked Samuel to the door, she found herself reluctant to end the evening. The house would feel empty after his departure, too quiet and too large for just herself and Thomas. "Thank you for the animals," she said. "Thomas will treasure them." "He's easy to please," Samuel replied. "Doesn't take much to make him happy, just someone who pays attention to what matters to him." The comment seemed to carry deeper meaning, and Margaret wondered whether Samuel was speaking only about Thomas or making a broader observation about the nature of contentment. "Good night, Samuel," she said softly. "Good night, Margaret." The use of her first name, spoken with quiet intimacy, sent a flutter of warmth through her chest. As she watched Samuel walk toward the bunkhouse, his figure silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Margaret realized that something had shifted fundamentally in her understanding of her life's possibilities. For 3 years, she had focused on preservation, maintaining the ranch, protecting Thomas, honoring Charles's memory. Samuel's presence had introduced the radical notion that life might also include growth, new connections, and the kind of quiet happiness she had thought was buried with her husband. Standing in her doorway, with the autumn night air cool against her face, Margaret allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to build something new rather than simply maintain something old. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, a recognition that the careful walls she had built around her heart might not be as impermeable as she had believed. Inside the house, Thomas's voice could be heard as he settled his wooden animals. For the night, his whispered conversations with his toys revealing a contentment that had been missing from his daily routine for far too long. Samuel had given them both something precious, not just carved toys or skilled labor, but the possibility that their small family might be capable of growth rather than mere survival. As Margaret locked the door and prepared for bed, she carried with her the memory of Samuel's smile and the sound of Thomas's laughter, both of them evidence that perhaps the best chapters of their lives were yet to be written. The invitation to tea had been forming in Margaret's mind for days before she finally found the courage to voice it. She discovered Samuel in the tack room, methodically cleaning and oiling leather harnesses with the patient thoroughness that characterized all his work. The autumn afternoon light streamed through the small window, illuminating the concentration. On his weathered features, "Samuel," she began, then paused, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of what she was about to propose. "I was wondering if you might join me for tea this afternoon. I thought we could use Mother's china." The significance of the offer wasn't lost on either of them. Margaret's mother's tea service, imported from England and reserved for only the most special occasions, represented the pinnacle of refined social gesture. To serve tea in such formal style suggested something far beyond the casual meals they had shared. Samuel set down the harness he had been working on, his expression thoughtful. "That's very kind, Mrs. Whitmore, but I wouldn't want to presume. Fine china seems like it might be wasted on someone who spends his days wrestling with cattle and fixing fence posts." "Nonsense," Margaret replied more firmly than she had intended. "Good china exists to be used, not admired from a distance. Besides, I think it's time I remembered how to be a proper hostess." The truth was more complex than her simple explanation suggested. Since Charles's death, Margaret had avoided the social rituals that had once defined her daily life. The formal tea service had remained in its cabinet, untouched and gathering dust, like so many other reminders of a more gracious existence. Using it now felt like reclaiming a part of herself she had thought permanently lost. An hour later, Margaret found herself in the rarely used formal parlour, arranging delicate porcelain cups and saucers on the mahogany table that had been her mother's pride. The china pattern, pale blue roses on cream background with gold trim, had graced the tables of 3 generations of women in her family. Each piece felt impossibly fragile in her work-roughened hands, a reminder of the careful gentility she had once taken for granted. Mrs. Patterson had prepared traditional accompaniments, delicate cucumber sandwiches, scones with jam and cream, and small cakes decorated with crystallized violets. The housekeeper's approval of the occasion was evident in the extra care she had taken with presentation, though she had refrained from commenting on the unusual nature of serving formal tea. To a ranch hand, Samuel appeared at the appointed time, having clearly made an effort to clean up from his work. His hair was damp from washing, and he wore his best shirt, still simple brown cotton, but clean and carefully pressed. He paused in the doorway, taking in the elegant table setting with an expression that suggested both appreciation and mild intimidation. "This is beautiful, Margaret," he said, using her first name with an ease that sent a small thrill through her. "Your mother had excellent taste. She would have liked you," Margaret replied, surprised by the certainty she felt about the statement. Mother believed that good manners and a kind heart were more important than social position. As they settled into the ritual of tea service, Margaret felt a strange doubling of experience. Part of her remained the practical ranch widow pouring tea for a hired hand, while another part remembered the young woman who had once presided over similar gatherings. With confidence and grace, Samuel's presence somehow made both versions of herself feel legitimate. "Tell me about your mountains," she said, as they settled into comfortable conversation. "You speak of them like old friends." Samuel's expression grew contemplative as he carefully balanced his teacup, smaller and more delicate than any vessel he was accustomed to using. "There's a peace up there that's hard to find anywhere else," he said slowly. "When you're above the tree line, looking out over valleys that stretch to the horizon, it puts things in perspective, makes you realize how small most troubles really are. But you came down from that peace to work on a ranch. Why? Peace can turn into loneliness if you're not careful," Samuel admitted. "Took me a long time to understand the difference between being alone and being isolated. Mountains don't judge you, but they don't care about you either. Sometimes a man needs to matter to somebody." The honesty of his answer touched something deep in Margaret's chest. She understood the distinction he was making. She had experienced both solitude and isolation in the years since Charles's death, learning that they were entirely different emotional states. "What made you think you might matter here?" she asked. Gently, Samuel was quiet for a moment, his attention apparently focused on the delicate pattern around the rim of his cup. When he looked up, His eyes held a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Thomas," he said simply. "First day I met him, he looked at me like I might be someone worth knowing. Been a long time since anyone looked at me that way." The admission revealed depths of loneliness that Samuel rarely allowed to show. Margaret realized that beneath his competent exterior lay wounds as deep as her own, different in origin perhaps, but similar in their capacity to isolate and diminish. "And now?" she asked. "Now I think maybe Thomas was right. Maybe I am someone worth knowing." The conversation that followed ranged across topics both practical and personal. Samuel spoke of his years in the mountains with a poet's appreciation for natural beauty, describing sunrise views from peaks whose names existed only on surveyors, maps and the particular quality of silence that existed above 10,000 feet. "I built a cabin up there," he said, "near a lake so clear you could see trout swimming 20 feet down. Thought I'd found the perfect life. No complications, no disappointments, no responsibilities beyond keeping myself fed and warm." "What? Changed your mind? Realized I was dying up there, just real slow and comfortable-like. Peace without purpose isn't peace at all. It's just waiting." Margaret understood exactly what he meant. Her own careful isolation had provided safety, but it had also created a kind of suspended animation where days passed without meaningful progress or growth. "Thomas has given you purpose," she observed. "Thomas and his mother," Samuel said quietly, meeting her eyes directly. "If that's not presuming too much to say." The statement hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the shift in their relationship. No longer employer and employee, not quite friends, but something more complex and potentially significant. Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas's arrival, fresh from his afternoon nap, and delighted to discover the formal tea service in progress. Samuel immediately made room for him at the table, producing a child-sized cup from the cabinet, as if he had always known where such things were kept. "Are we having a party?" Thomas asked, his eyes wide with excitement at the unusual elegance of the occasion. "Something like that," Margaret replied, watching as Samuel helped Thomas arrange his wooden animals around his place setting. The carved figures looked charming rather than out of place among the fine china, as if the formality of the occasion elevated rather than diminished their simple craftsmanship. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret found herself observing the easy interaction between Samuel and Thomas with growing wonder. Samuel possessed an intuitive understanding of how to include Thomas in adult conversation without condescension, asking his opinion on ranch matters and listening to his responses with genuine attention. "Samuel says I'm getting good at counting cattle," Thomas reported proudly. "Yesterday I helped count all the ones in the north pasture, and I only made one mistake." "That's excellent," Margaret said, though she felt a flutter of concern about Thomas working around potentially dangerous livestock. "You were careful, I hope." "Samuel taught me the safe way to count," Thomas assured her. "You stand where the cattle can see you but can't reach you, and you count by tens instead of ones. It's much faster." The casual mention of safety protocols reassured Margaret that Samuel was including Thomas in ranch work responsibly rather than recklessly. She was beginning to understand that Samuel's approach to her son involved building competence rather than simply providing entertainment. As evening approached and the tea service was cleared away, Margaret felt a reluctance to end the afternoon that surprised her with its intensity. The formal ritual had created a space outside their usual roles, allowing them to interact as equals rather than employer and employee. "Thank you for indulging an old woman's fancy," she said as they stood. "In the parlor doorway, old woman," Samuel repeated, his tone suggesting gentle disagreement. "I don't see any old women here. I see a gracious lady who knows how to make a working man feel welcome at her table." The compliment, delivered with Samuel's characteristic sincerity, brought warmth to Margaret's cheeks. It had been years since anyone had spoken to her in terms of personal attraction rather than social obligation. Perhaps we could do this again, she said impulsively. I find I've missed having proper conversations over tea. I'd like that very much, Samuel replied, though next time maybe I could bring something to contribute. I make decent biscuits when I put my mind to it. The suggestion that there would indeed be a next time, and that Samuel wanted to participate as a contributor rather than merely a guest, sent a flutter of anticipation through Margaret's chest. As she watched him walk toward the bunkhouse in the gathering dusk, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The formal tea service had bridged the social distance between them, creating a new dynamic that felt both natural and slightly scandalous. Margaret was a wealthy widow, entertaining a ranch hand in her finest parlor, behavior that would certainly generate gossip if observed by the wrong people. But as she carefully washed her mother's china and returned it to its cabinet, Margaret found that she cared less about potential gossip than she might have expected. Samuel's presence at her table had felt right in ways that transcended social convention, and the easy conversation they had shared suggested possibilities that both thrilled and frightened her. Standing in her kitchen with the autumn evening settling around the ranch, Margaret allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been carefully avoiding. She was developing feelings for Samuel Ridge that went far beyond gratitude for his help with Thomas or appreciation for his competence as a ranch hand. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. For 3 years, she had defined herself primarily as Thomas's mother and Charles's widow, roles that provided identity but limited possibilities. Samuel's presence had begun to awaken aspects of herself she had thought permanently dormant, the woman who enjoyed elegant conversation, who appreciated masculine attention, who might yet discover that her capacity for love had not died with her husband. Outside her kitchen window, lights were beginning to appear in the bunkhouse and other outbuildings as the ranch settled into its evening routine. Somewhere among those lights was Samuel, probably reading by lamplight or perhaps carving. Another gift for Thomas. The thought of his steady presence brought a sense of security that Margaret had not felt since Charles's death. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and decisions, but tonight she would allow herself to savor the memory of afternoon tea shared with a man who saw her as something more than a business obligation or social duty. The possibility that such afternoons might become regular occurrences felt like a gift she was only beginning to understand how to receive. The military medal was discovered by accident, revealed when a sudden autumn storm drove Margaret to bring clean laundry from the line to the bunkhouse where Samuel had hung his clothes to dry. She knocked and called his name, receiving no response. He was working in the far pastures with Tom Bradley, so she entered to gather the garments before they could be soaked by the approaching downpour. Samuel's quarters were spartanly arranged but scrupulously clean. A narrow bed with military-precise corners, a small table serving as desk, and a single trunk that contained what appeared to be his entire worldly possessions. As Margaret gathered his shirts and trousers from the makeshift clothesline, a gust of wind from the open door scattered some papers from the table. Kneeling to collect them, she saw that most were letters, correspondence with former employers providing references for his work. But beneath them, partially hidden in a small wooden box, something metallic caught the light. Margaret hesitated, knowing she was already intruding on Samuel's privacy, but curiosity overcame propriety as she glimpsed what appeared to be an official military decoration. The medal was more elaborate than she had expected, a bronze star suspended from a ribbon of red, white, and blue stripes. Even with her limited knowledge of military honors, Margaret recognized it as something significant, not the kind of service medal awarded routinely to all soldiers. Accompanying it was a citation written in formal military language that spoke of conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty under enemy fire. The contradiction between the humble ranch hand she knew and the decorated war hero described in the citation left Margaret stunned. Samuel had mentioned military service, but had given no indication that his contributions had been exceptional or officially recognized. The man who fixed music boxes and carved wooden animals had apparently also distinguished himself in battle. She was still kneeling beside the overturned box when Samuel's voice reached her from the doorway. "Storm caught you, did it?" Margaret looked up to find him standing in the entrance, water dripping from his hat and coat, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. Her kneeling beside his personal belongings, the medal and citation visible in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, rising to face him. "I came to get the laundry before it got soaked, and the wind scattered your papers. I didn't mean to pry." Samuel stepped inside, closing the door against the driving rain. His movements were deliberate but not angry, suggesting resignation rather than outrage at her discovery. "Guess you found something I don't talk about much," he said quietly, hanging his wet coat on a peg. Margaret still held the medal, its weight substantial in her palm. "Bronze Star," she said. "The citation mentions saving the lives of wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Citations probably more generous than the facts warranted," Samuel replied, though his tone suggested discomfort rather than false modesty. "Awards get handed out sometimes more for surviving than for anything particularly heroic." "That's not what this says," Margaret observed, reading from the document. "Sergeant Ridge repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to carry wounded comrades to safety, continuing his efforts despite sustaining injuries that would have incapacitated lesser men." Samuel took the medal from her hands, his fingers tracing the Bronze Star with what might have been regret. Different world back then. Different man, too. "Why don't you speak of it?" The question hung in the air as Samuel carefully returned the medal to its box. When he looked at Margaret, his eyes held a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "Because being a hero didn't save the people who mattered most," he said simply. "All that conspicuous gallantry couldn't keep my brother safe or bring him home alive. Kind of puts things in perspective about what medals are really worth." The revelation explained much about Samuel's reluctance to discuss his military service. Margaret understood now that his decorations represented not pride but guilt, recognition for achievements that felt meaningless in the face of personal loss. "Danny was with you in the war?" she asked gently. "Same unit. I spent 4 years keeping other men's brothers alive while failing to protect my own." Samuel's voice carried a weight of self-recrimination that time had not diminished. "Hard to feel proud about medals when the one person you most wanted to save didn't make it home." Margaret felt her heart constrict at the pain in his voice. She was beginning to understand that Samuel's gentleness with Thomas stemmed not just from natural kindness, but from a desperate need to succeed where he had previously failed, to protect someone vulnerable, to prove that his brother's death had not rendered him permanently unable to fulfill such responsibilities. "What happened to Danny?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be difficult to hear. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on the storm raging outside the small window. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone recounting events too painful for emotional inflection. "We were in Georgia, late in the war. Most of the fighting was over, but there were still pockets of resistance. Danny got separated from the main unit during a skirmish. He was always wandering off, chasing butterflies or trying to help wounded horses. By the time I found him, some of our own men had mistaken him for a deserter." Margaret felt sick understanding dawning. "They shot him?" "Fear makes people stupid," Samuel said bitterly. "Danny couldn't explain himself the way they expected, couldn't answer their questions in the right way. They decided he was either a coward or a spy, and they didn't wait for me to arrive and set them straight." The tragedy was worse than Margaret had imagined. Not death in battle, which at least carried honor, but murder by friendly fire born of ignorance and prejudice. No wonder Samuel carried such guilt about his military service. All his heroism had been worthless in the face of the one loss that mattered most. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "Sorry doesn't bring him back," Samuel replied, though his tone held sadness rather than anger. "But taking care of Thomas, helping him become everything he can be, that feels like something Danny would approve of, like maybe I can still get it right, even if I'm 15 years too late." The admission revealed the true source of Samuel's devotion to Thomas. Her son represented more than just a child who needed help. He was Samuel's chance at redemption, an opportunity to succeed where he had previously failed so catastrophically. "Thomas isn't Danny," Margaret said carefully, sensing dangerous emotional territory. "No," Samuel agreed. "Thomas is luckier. He has a mother who understands his worth and won't let anyone hurt him. Danny had only me, and I wasn't enough." Margaret stepped closer, moved by an impulse to offer comfort that transcended their usual careful boundaries. "You were enough, Samuel. What happened to Danny wasn't your failure. It was the failure of men who couldn't see past their own fear and ignorance." Samuel looked at her with an expression that suggested he wanted to believe her words, but couldn't quite manage the leap of faith required. "Maybe, but knowing something in your head and feeling it in your heart are different things. I've spent 15 years trying to bridge that gap." The conversation was interrupted by a change in the storm's intensity, the driving. Rain had softened to a steady patter that suggested the worst had passed. Margaret realized she had been in the bunkhouse far longer than propriety would typically allow, but the intimacy of Samuel's revelations had created a space outside normal social conventions. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "Mrs. Patterson will be wondering what happened to me." Samuel nodded, but made no immediate move toward the door. "Margaret," he said, using her first name with the careful deliberation of someone testing new territory. "Thank you for listening. It's been a long time since I told anyone about Danny. Thank you for trusting me with the story," she replied. "I understand now why Thomas's welfare means so much to you." "It's more than that," Samuel said quietly. "Thomas matters, but so do you. Somewhere along the way, protecting him turned into caring about both of you. Didn't plan for that to happen." The admission sent a flutter of warmth through Margaret's chest, even as it raised questions about the wisdom of such emotional entanglement. Samuel's feelings for her were clearly connected to his guilt about his brother, which complicated the purity of his affection in ways that both troubled and touched her. "Samuel," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to respond to his confession. "You don't have to say anything," he assured her. "Just wanted you to know where I stand in case that matters to your thinking about things." As Margaret made her way back to the main house through the diminishing storm, she carried with her a new understanding of the man who had become so important to her small family. Samuel's heroism during the war, his devastating loss, and his years of wandering self-exile painted a picture of someone whose capacity for love was matched only by his fear of failing those he cared about. The revelation about his military service explained much about his competence and leadership qualities, but more importantly, it revealed the depths of his character. Samuel was not simply a kind man who happened to be good with Thomas. He was someone who had learned through terrible experience the true cost of failing to protect the vulnerable. That evening, as Margaret helped Thomas prepare for bed, she found herself watching Samuel through the window as he moved about his evening chores. The knowledge of his hidden medal and the story behind it had changed something fundamental in how she saw him. He was no longer just the helpful stranger who had arrived at her ranch. He was a man carrying wounds as deep as her own, seeking redemption through service to others. "Mama," Thomas said, interrupting her thoughts. "Samuel looks sad tonight. Did something happen?" Margaret was continually amazed by her son's emotional perceptiveness, his ability to read subtle changes in people's moods that others might miss. "Sometimes people carry sadness from things that happened long ago," she explained. "It doesn't mean they're sad about right now. Can we make him feel better?" The question, asked with Thomas's characteristic desire to help those he cared about, touched Margaret deeply. Her son's instinct to comfort others had survived his illness intact, perhaps even strengthened by his own experience of vulnerability. "I think we already do make him feel better," she said, tucking Thomas's wooden animals beside his pillow. "Sometimes the best way to help someone with old sadness is to give them new reasons to be happy." As Thomas drifted off to sleep with his music box playing its familiar melody, Margaret remained at his bedside, thinking about Samuel's revelation and its implications for their growing relationship. His feelings for her were genuine, but they were also complicated by his need for redemption and his fear of repeating past failures. The complexity didn't diminish her growing affection for him, but it did require careful consideration. Margaret had learned through her own experience with loss that healing required more than good intentions. It demanded honest confrontation with grief and guilt, and the courage to risk new attachments despite the possibility of future pain. Samuel had spent 15 years running from such risks, and his arrival at her ranch might represent his first attempt to stop running. Whether that attempt would succeed would depend not just on his courage, but on her willingness to help him discover that redemption was possible, and that the capacity to protect and love could be reclaimed even after devastating failure. Outside her window, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh with the promise of clearer skies ahead. In the morning, she would find ways to let Samuel know that his trust in sharing Danny's story had not been misplaced, and that perhaps, carefully, gradually, they might build something together that honored both their losses and their hopes. For the future, the legal document arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by a well-dressed stranger who introduced himself as Harrison Caldwell, Esquire, representing the firm of Caldwell, Morrison and Associates from Helena. Margaret received him in the parlor, noting his expensive clothes and the leather satchel that suggested important business. "Mrs. Whitmore," Caldwell began after accepting her offer of coffee, "I'm here regarding a matter that may come as something of a surprise. It concerns mineral rights to a portion of your ranch property." Margaret felt a flutter of unease. Charles had been meticulous about such legal matters, and she had continued his practice of ensuring all property rights were clearly documented and current. "I believe all our mineral rights are properly recorded," she said carefully. "Indeed, they are," Caldwell agreed, opening his satchel and withdrawing a thick folder. "However, there's a prior claim that predates your husband's purchase of the property, a claim that was never formally resolved and remains legally valid." The lawyer spread several documents across the coffee table: deeds, surveys, and legal, in papers that meant little to Margaret without careful study. But one signature caught her attention immediately, written in the same careful handwriting she had seen on letters and references: Samuel Ridge. "I don't understand," she said, though a cold certainty was beginning to form in her chest. "Mr. Samuel Ridge holds legal title to mineral rights on approximately 2,000 acres of what is now your ranch," Caldwell explained. "The rights were granted to his father, Jonas Ridge, in 1847 as payment for services rendered to the territorial government. Upon Jonas Ridge's death, they passed to his son Samuel, who has never relinquished or sold them." Margaret stared at the documents, her mind reeling with implications. "You're saying Samuel, my Samuel Ridge, owns part of my ranch?" "The mineral rights, yes. Not the surface rights, which remain yours, but anything beneath the ground. Coal, metals, oil, whatever might be found there." Caldwell's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else you should know. We've been retained by the Consolidated Mining Corporation. They've discovered significant copper deposits on the affected acreage and are prepared to offer substantial compensation for mining rights." The room seemed to shift around Margaret as the full implications became clear. Samuel had known. He had known from the moment he arrived at her ranch that he held legal claim to part of her property. His offer to work for room and board, his kindness to Thomas, his growing intimacy with her, all of it might have been calculated deception designed to gain her trust before revealing his true purpose. How substantial, she managed to ask. Caldwell named a figure that made Margaret's breath catch. Enough money to buy several ranches the size of hers, enough to ensure comfort for multiple generations. And Samuel had said nothing, had worked for $30 a month while sitting on knowledge of wealth that dwarfed her own considerable resources. "Where is Mr. Ridge now?" Caldwell asked. "The mining company is eager to begin negotiations." "He's working in the south pasture," Margaret replied mechanically, "but I think I should speak with him first, before any business discussions take place." "Of course," Caldwell agreed, though his expression suggested impatience with such niceties. "However, I should mention that Consolidated Mining has also expressed interest in purchasing your surface rights to the affected area. They're prepared to make an offer that would be quite generous, given that mining operations will likely make ranching impossible on that portion of your land." After Caldwell departed, promising to return the following day for Samuel's response, Margaret sat alone in her parlor, staring at the legal documents that had shattered her understanding of the past months. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of growing intimacy between herself and Samuel took on new and sinister meaning when viewed through the lens of his hidden agenda. She thought of Thomas's joy in Samuel's company, the trust her son had placed in the man who had apparently been calculating the value of their land from his first day at the ranch. She remembered their formal tea service, the intimate conversations about loss and healing, Samuel's patient care during Thomas's episodes, all of it potentially false, performances designed to soften her defenses before the inevitable revelation of his true purpose. The worst part was how thoroughly she had been deceived. Samuel's knowledge of ranching, his genuine skills with horses and cattle, his understanding of Thomas's needs, none of it had been lies, but all of it had served to establish credibility for what might be an elaborate confidence scheme. Margaret was still sitting with the documents when Thomas found her, fresh from his afternoon lessons and eager to share his latest accomplishment in arithmetic. He stopped short when he saw her expression, his face immediately creasing with concern. "Mama, what's wrong?" "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," she said automatically, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. "Just some business matters that need attention." Thomas approached cautiously, his emotional sensitivity alerting him to currents of distress he couldn't fully understand. "Is Samuel in trouble?" The question, innocent as it was, cut through Margaret's heart like a blade. Her son's attachment to Samuel was genuine and deep. How could she explain that the man who had become so important to them both might have been using them from the beginning? "Why would you think Samuel was in trouble?" she asked. "Because you looked the way you did when Papa got sick," Thomas said simply. "Like something bad was going to happen." Margaret gathered her son into her arms, holding him close while struggling to maintain composure. Thomas's capacity for reading emotional situations had survived his illness intact, and she couldn't shield him from her turmoil without raising more questions than she was prepared to answer. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions," she said carefully. "It doesn't mean anything bad will happen, just that things might change." The sound of horses approaching the house interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Margaret could see Samuel returning from his work, unaware that his carefully constructed deception was about to be exposed. She watched him dismount and tend to his horse with the same patient care she had come to associate with all his actions, and felt a fresh wave of anger at how thoroughly he had convinced her of his simple honesty. "Thomas," she said, setting her son back on his feet, "I need you to go help Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen. Mama has to talk to Samuel about some ranch business." Thomas nodded, though his expression remained troubled. As he left the parlor, Margaret steeled herself for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of her adult life. She had been betrayed before, Business associates of Charles's had occasionally attempted to take advantage of her widowed status, but never by someone she had allowed into her heart. Samuel's knock came at the front door rather than the kitchen entrance, suggesting he sensed something unusual in the air. Margaret opened it to find him standing with his hat in his hands, his expression immediately showing concern at whatever he read in her face. "Margaret, what's happened?" "I think you know what's happened," she replied coldly, stepping aside to allow him entry. "Or perhaps I should say, I've finally learned what you've been hiding since the day you arrived." Samuel's face went pale as he followed her into the parlor and saw the legal documents spread across the coffee table. His reaction, immediate recognition rather than confusion, confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions about his knowledge of the situation. "You know about the mineral rights," he said quietly. "I know you've been lying to me for months," Margaret replied, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I know you've been working for $30 a month while sitting on knowledge that you could claim ownership of half my ranch. I know that everything, your kindness to Thomas, your help with the ranch, your—" She stopped, unable to voice the intimacy that had been growing between them. "Margaret, it's not what you think, isn't it?" she challenged. "A mining company is prepared to pay you a fortune for rights you've owned all along. Rights you never mentioned while you were worming your way into my family's affections." Samuel's expression grew pained, but he made no attempt to deny her accusations. "Yes, I've known about the mineral rights since before I came here, but I never intended to claim them." "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you'd react. Exactly the way you're reacting now. You'd assume the worst about my motives and order me off your property." Margaret laughed bitterly. "As opposed to letting me discover it through a lawyer representing mining interests? That was your plan for honesty." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his hands twisting his hat brim in a gesture of nervousness she had never seen from him before. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone about to reveal truths he had hoped to keep buried. "The mining company has been after those rights for 2 years, he said slowly. "They tracked me down in Colorado, made their offer, wanted me to come here and negotiate access to your land. I told them no, that I wasn't interested in selling. But you came anyway." "I came because they wouldn't take no for an answer. They hired private investigators, started making threats about what might happen to a woman alone with a disabled child if she proved difficult about allowing mining operations to proceed. I came here to make sure you were safe, to see if their threats had any substance behind them." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her again, as Samuel's explanation introduced complexities she hadn't considered. "You came here to protect me?" "I came to assess the situation," Samuel corrected. "I figured I'd work here for a few weeks, make sure you weren't being pressured or threatened, then move on without ever mentioning the mineral rights. I never intended to stay." "Then why did you?" Samuel's eyes met hers directly, and in them she saw the same vulnerability she had glimpsed when he spoke of his brother's death. "Because Thomas needed me. Because you needed help, even if you were too proud to ask for it. Because for the first time in 15 years, I found a place where I felt like I mattered." The admission rang with sincerity, but Margaret's trust had been too badly shaken to accept it at face value. "And the mining money? You expect me to believe you're not interested in a fortune?" "I don't care about the money," Samuel said simply. "I've been living on next to nothing for years. Money won't bring Danny back or make me feel less guilty about failing to protect him. But taking care of Thomas, helping you with the ranch, that feels like redemption." Margaret stared at him, torn between the desire to believe his explanation and the cold logic that suggested she was being manipulated by a master of deception. The documents on the coffee table seemed to mock her confusion, their legal certainty a stark contrast to the emotional complexity of Samuel's claims. "The lawyer says the mining company wants to buy my surface rights too," she said finally. "They want to turn this ranch into an open pit mine." Samuel's expression hardened. "Over my dead body. I'll sell the mineral rights to you for $1 before I let them destroy your home." "You can do that?" The rights are mine to dispose of as I see fit. I can sell them, give them away, or sit on them until I die. What I won't do is let anyone use them to hurt you and Thomas." Margaret felt tears threatening as the full complexity of the situation became clear. Samuel might indeed have been protecting rather than deceiving her, but his methods had created a tangle of legal and emotional complications that seemed impossible to resolve cleanly. "I don't know what to believe," she said finally. "I don't know how to trust you after this." Samuel nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting such a response. "I understand. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was afraid you'd send me away before you got to know who I really am." "And who are you really, Samuel? The war hero, the guilt-ridden wanderer, the man who carves toys for my son, the potential mining millionaire? I feel like I don't know you at all." "I'm all of those things," Samuel replied quietly, "but mostly I'm a man who's been alone too long and found something worth protecting. If that means giving up mineral rights worth a fortune, so be it. If it means leaving so you can have peace of mind about my motives, I'll do that too." The offer to leave, made without drama or manipulation, somehow carried more weight than any of his previous explanations. Margaret realized that a man truly motivated by greed would be fighting harder to stay, would be making more elaborate justifications for his deception. Samuel's willingness to walk away suggested that his feelings for her and Thomas might indeed be genuine. "I need time to think," she said finally. "I need to understand what this means for Thomas and me, for the ranch." "Of course," Samuel agreed. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight, give you space to sort through everything. But Margaret," he paused, his expression intense, "whatever you decide about me, don't let them pressure you into selling your land. This ranch is Thomas's inheritance, his future. Don't let anyone take that away from him." After Samuel left, Margaret sat alone with the legal documents and the weight of decisions that would affect the rest of their lives. The man she had been falling in love with had revealed depths of complexity that challenged everything she thought. She knew about trust, deception, and the nature of truth itself. Outside her window, she could see lights in the barn, where Samuel was presumably settling in for a sleepless night of his own. Tomorrow would bring the lawyer's return and demands for answers that she wasn't sure she was prepared to give. The sound of Thomas calling for her from upstairs reminded Margaret that whatever she decided about Samuel and the mineral rights, her son's well-being remained her primary responsibility. As she climbed the stairs to help him with his bedtime routine, she carried with her the knowledge that their carefully ordered life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The only question that remained was whether that change would bring destruction or transformation, and whether she possessed the wisdom to tell the difference. Margaret spent the night in her father's old study, unable to sleep, turning the pages of Charles's pocket watch as if the steady ticking might provide answers to questions that seemed to have no clear solutions. The timepiece had been her husband's most cherished possession, inherited from his father and carried through every important moment of his life. Now it seemed to mock her with its relentless marking of seconds that brought her closer to decisions she felt unprepared to make. Dawn found her still in the leather chair where Charles had once conducted his business. The legal documents spread before her like accusations. She had read them dozens of times, hoping to find some loophole or misunderstanding that would restore the simple clarity her life had possessed just 24 hours earlier. But the papers remained stubbornly unambiguous. Samuel Ridge held legitimate claim to mineral rights that could transform him from hired hand to wealthy man with a single signature. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Mrs. Patterson's arrival to begin the morning routine. Margaret heard the housekeeper pause outside the study door, probably noting the light that had burned all night, but Eleanor's discretion prevented her from intruding on what was obviously a private crisis. Thomas's voice soon joined the household's. "Awakening sounds. calling for his mama with the expectation of routine that had defined their mornings for months. Margaret steeled herself to face her son's questions about Samuel's absence from the breakfast table. Thomas had grown accustomed to sharing his morning meal with the man who had become so important to his daily happiness. "Mama?" Thomas appeared in the doorway, his wooden horse clutched in one hand, and his expression showing concern at finding her in the study rather than the kitchen. "Mrs. Patterson says Samuel isn't coming for breakfast. Is he sick?" Margaret set aside Charles's watch and opened her arms to her son, gathering him close as she searched for words that would explain an adult situation in terms he could understand without causing unnecessary distress. "Samuel is fine, sweetheart," she said carefully, "but we have some important things to discuss about the ranch, and that means our routine might be different for a few days." Thomas studied her face with the acute perception that had survived. His illness intact. "Are you sending Samuel away?" The direct question struck Margaret like a physical blow. Her son's attachment to Samuel ran deeper than casual affection. Thomas had found in the mountain man something he had been missing since his father's death, a masculine presence who treated him with respect and patience, who saw potential rather than limitation. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "Some things have happened that make the situation complicated." "What kind of things?" Margaret hesitated, weighing the need for honesty against her desire to protect Thomas from adult concerns. But her son's emotional intelligence had always been remarkable, and she had learned that he often handled truth better than uncertainty. "It turns out Samuel owns part of our ranch," she said simply. "Land that's underneath our land, where valuable things might be buried. He never told us about it, and now some businessmen want to pay him a lot of money for those rights." Thomas considered this information with the serious concentration he brought to difficult arithmetic problems. "Did Samuel know all along?" "Yes, he did, but he didn't ask for money. He just worked hard and helped us." The observation, made with Thomas's characteristic directness, cut through the complex legal and emotional issues to the heart of the matter. Samuel had indeed worked without claiming what was legally his, had given months of labor and care without seeking compensation beyond room, board, and wages far below what his rights were worth. "That's true," Margaret acknowledged, "but not telling us about it was still wrong." "Maybe he was scared we wouldn't like him anymore if we knew he was rich," Thomas suggested, with the intuitive understanding that sometimes emerged from his altered mental state. "Sometimes people act funny around rich people." The simple explanation carried more wisdom than Margaret was comfortable acknowledging. Thomas's observation that wealth could complicate relationships was accurate. She herself might have been more guarded around Samuel if she had known about his potential fortune from the beginning. The morning progressed with the artificial normalcy that accompanies crisis management. Mrs. Patterson served breakfast without comment on Samuel's absence, though Margaret noticed the housekeeper preparing an extra plate that was subsequently taken to the barn. Eleanor's loyalty extended to both Samuel and the family, and she was apparently unwilling to let anyone go hungry while the adults sorted through their complications. Dr. Harrison arrived for Thomas's scheduled examination, and Margaret found herself grateful for the distraction of medical routine. The doctor noted continued improvement in Thomas's coordination and speech patterns, observing that her son seemed more confident and engaged than during previous visits. "Whatever you've been doing differently is working," Dr. Harrison remarked, as they watched Thomas play with his wooden animals in the corner of the study. "His progress over the past few months has been remarkable." Margaret felt a pang of recognition at the timeline the doctor referenced. Thomas's improvement had coincided exactly with Samuel's arrival and increasing involvement in his daily life. The man who might be deceiving her had also been instrumental in her son's healing. "Dr. Harrison," she said impulsively, "what's your professional opinion about Thomas's need for masculine guidance? Reverend Matthews has suggested that a boy his age requires a father figure." The doctor considered the question thoughtfully while observing Thomas's absorbed play. Thomas certainly benefits from positive male interaction, he said slowly, but the specific identity of that figure matters less than the quality of the relationship. Consistency, patience, and genuine care are more important than blood relation or social convention. The assessment provided no easy answers, but it confirmed Margaret's growing understanding that Samuel's importance to Thomas transcended simple friendship. Her son had found in the mountain man something essential to his continued development, a relationship that combined guidance with respect, challenge with support. Lawyer Caldwell returned precisely at noon, accompanied by 2 additional men he introduced as representatives of Consolidated Mining Corporation. Margaret received them in the parlor, noting their expensive clothes and calculating expressions with growing distaste for the business they represented. "Mrs. Whitmore," Caldwell began without preamble, "have you located Mr. Ridge? We're eager to complete our negotiations." "Mr. Ridge is on the property," Margaret replied carefully. "But before any business proceeds, I have some questions about your company's intentions." The mining representatives exchanged glances before the older of the 2 stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm James Morrison, Vice President of Operations for Consolidated Mining. We're prepared to offer very generous terms for both the mineral rights and your surface holdings in the affected area." Morrison spread new documents across the coffee table, contracts, surveys, and financial projections that painted a picture of massive industrial operations, transforming her peaceful ranch into something unrecognizable. The proposed mining site encompassed not just the 2,000 acres covered by Samuel's mineral rights, but additional acreage that would be necessary for equipment access, waste disposal, and administrative facilities. "You're talking about destroying a significant portion of the ranch," Margaret observed. "We prefer to think of it as unlocking the land's true potential," Morrison replied smoothly. "The copper deposits we've identified could provide employment for hundreds of workers and generate substantial tax revenue for the county. Your compensation would be more than adequate to purchase comparable property elsewhere." Margaret studied the projected timeline for the mining operation. A 20-year commitment that would leave behind a scarred landscape unsuitable for ranching or any other traditional use. "And when you're finished, what happens to the land then?" "That would be 20 years from now," Morrison said, with the dismissive tone of someone accustomed to thinking in quarterly profits rather than generational consequences. "Market conditions and technological advances make it impossible to predict future land use requirements." The casual disregard for long-term environmental impact reinforced Margaret's growing conviction that the mining company viewed her ranch as nothing more than an impediment to wealth extraction. They saw no value in the careful stewardship that had built the W into a sustainable operation, no worth in the legacy she hoped to leave for Thomas. "I'll need to discuss this with Mr. Ridge before any decisions are made," she said firmly. "Of course," Caldwell agreed. "However, I should mention that if Mr. Ridge chooses to exercise his mineral rights regardless of your cooperation, our legal position would allow us to proceed with development. Your consent would make the process smoother, but it isn't strictly necessary." The veiled threat confirmed Margaret's worst suspicions about the mining company's tactics. They were prepared to destroy her ranch, whether she cooperated or not, using Samuel's rights as leverage to force her compliance. After the lawyers departed with promises to return the following day for Samuel's final answer, Margaret walked to the barn where she found him, repairing harness leather with the same meticulous attention he brought to all his tasks. He looked up as she approached, his expression showing the strain of a sleepless night and uncertain future. "They came back," she said simply. "I figured they would." "What did they want?" Margaret described the morning's meeting, watching Samuel's face grow increasingly grim as she outlined the mining company's plans for comprehensive destruction of the ranch. His reaction, immediate anger rather than excitement about potential wealth, provided another piece of evidence supporting his claim that money wasn't his primary motivation. "They can't force you to sell your surface rights," he said finally. "Even if I sold them the mineral claims, you could refuse to cooperate with their operations." They suggested otherwise. Something about legal precedent for necessary access to mineral deposits. Samuel's jaw tightened. Lawyers can say anything, doesn't make it true, but fighting them in court would cost more than most people can afford, and they know it. "What are you going to do?" Samuel set aside the harness and faced her directly. "Depends on what you want me to do. If you want me to sell them the rights and leave, I'll do that. If you want me to refuse their offer and stay to help you fight, then I'll do that too. What I won't do is make this decision without knowing where you stand." The request for guidance placed the burden of choice squarely on Margaret's shoulders. Samuel was offering to let her determine his future, to subordinate his legal rights to her preferences. The gesture suggested either genuine care for her well-being or sophisticated manipulation, and she was no longer certain she could tell the difference. "I need to think about Thomas," she said finally. "Whatever I decide has to be what's best for him." "Agreed," Samuel said. "But remember that Thomas's best interests might not be the same as what feels safest in the short term. That boy's got more courage than either of us gives him credit for." That evening, after Thomas had been settled for the night, Margaret sat in the parlour with Charles's pocket watch, listening to its steady rhythm while contemplating decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. The watch had marked every significant moment of her husband's life: his wedding, Thomas's birth, the building of the ranch into a successful enterprise. Now it seemed to be counting down to the moment when she would either honor his legacy or abandon it for the promise of easier prosperity. The sound of movement outside drew her attention to the window, where she could see Samuel moving about. The barn with a lantern, apparently preparing for another restless night. His willingness to sleep apart from the household while she made her decision spoke to a consideration for her comfort that felt genuine rather than calculated. Tomorrow would bring Caldwell's return and demands for final answers. Margaret would have to choose between the security of accepting the mining company's offer, financial compensation that would ensure Thomas's future regardless of his limitations, and the uncertainty of fighting for a legacy that might ultimately prove impossible to preserve. Charles's watch continued its steady ticking, marking seconds that brought her closer to decisions that would define not just her future, but Thomas's inheritance and Samuel's fate. As she prepared for what might be her final night of uncertainty, Margaret found herself wishing that loving someone, whether husband, son, or the complicated man sleeping in her barn, didn't require such impossible choices between safety and authenticity, between preservation and transformation. The watch face showed midnight as Margaret finally climbed the stairs to her bedroom, carrying with her the weight of choices that would echo through generations yet unborn. Outside her window, the Montana sky stretched endlessly above a ranch that might soon cease to exist in any form recognizable to those who had built it with such care and hope. The decision crystallized in Margaret's mind, not through careful deliberation, but through the simple act of watching Thomas sleep. She had entered his room to check on him before retiring, as had become her nightly custom, and found him curled around his wooden horse with Charles's wedding photograph clutched in his free hand, a picture he had retrieved from her dressing table and claimed as his own treasure. The image of her son, holding both his past and present sources of comfort, struck Margaret with unexpected clarity. Thomas wasn't choosing between his father's memory and Samuel's current presence. He was embracing both, understanding intuitively that love didn't require the abandonment of previous attachments. Perhaps, Margaret realized, she had been creating a false choice where none existed. She spent the pre-dawn hours in Charles' study, not wrestling with uncertainty this time, but preparing for the confrontation she now knew was inevitable. The wedding photograph Thomas had claimed wasn't the only reminder of Charles in the room. His business journals, his careful records, his methodical approach to problem-solving all testified to a man who had built something lasting through patient work rather than dramatic gestures. Charles would not have sold the ranch to mining interests. He would have found a way to protect what he had built while honoring legitimate claims against it. The realization that she was facing a situation Charles himself might have encountered, and how he would have handled it, provided Margaret with the guidance she had been seeking. When Samuel appeared at the kitchen door for breakfast, she was ready for him. "We need to talk," she said simply, setting down her coffee cup, "before the lawyers arrive." Samuel nodded, his expression showing he had been expecting such a conversation. "I've been thinking, too, made some decisions about what I need to do." "Let me go first," Margaret interrupted, needing to voice her conclusions before courage failed. I've decided to trust you. Not because I'm certain you've told me everything, but because Thomas trusts you, and his judgment has always been better than mine when it comes to reading people's hearts." Samuel's face showed surprise, followed by something that might have been relief. "Margaret, I'm not finished," she continued. "I'm trusting you, but I'm also asking you to trust me. I want you to sell the mineral rights to me for the dollar you mentioned, not as a gift, but as a business transaction that makes me the legal owner of something the mining company wants. That would put you in direct conflict with Consolidated Mining. They won't give up easily." "Good," Margaret said, with a firmness that surprised them both. "I have no intention of making this easy for them. Charles built this ranch to last for generations. I won't be the one who sells Thomas's inheritance for the convenience of people who see our home as nothing but an impediment to profit." Samuel studied her face, apparently searching for signs of uncertainty or misgiving. "Fighting them will be expensive and difficult. They have lawyers and political connections. You'd be David going up against Goliath." "Then it's fortunate that I have experience with slings and stones," Margaret replied, with a smile that felt foreign after days of anxiety. "Besides, I won't be fighting alone. I'll have a partner who understands mining law and isn't intimidated by men in expensive suits." "Margaret, are you asking me to—" "I'm asking you to marry me," she said, the words emerging with a clarity that seemed to surprise her as much as him. "Not because I need a man to handle my business affairs, but because I love you and Thomas loves you, and I'm tired of pretending that fear is more important than happiness." Samuel's expression shifted through surprise, joy, and concern in rapid succession. "The proposal should come from me," he said finally. "According to who? Besides, you've been too busy wrestling with guilt about your brother and uncertainty about—" "You're welcome here to get around to asking the important questions. Someone had to take charge of the situation." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's appearance in the kitchen doorway, drawn by voices that sounded different from the careful formality that had characterized recent exchanges between the adults. He looked from his mother to Samuel, with the acute perception that had become his hallmark since the illness. "Are you arguing or making up?" he asked with characteristic directness. "Making up," Margaret replied, before Samuel could respond. "In fact, we're making plans." "What kind of plans?" Margaret looked at Samuel, seeking confirmation that her bold assumptions about their future were shared. His expression suggested amazement rather than disagreement, and she took that as permission to continue. "The kind of plans that mean Samuel won't be sleeping in the barn anymore," she said. "The kind that mean our family might be getting bigger instead of smaller." Thomas's face lit up with joy that seemed to illuminate the entire kitchen. "Samuel's going to be my new papa." "If he says yes to my proposal," Margaret replied, noting Samuel's stunned expression with amusement. "Though I should probably let him answer for himself." Samuel looked between Margaret and Thomas, his weathered face showing emotions too complex for easy categorization. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone making promises he intended to keep regardless. of cost. Yes, he said simply, to all of it. The marriage, the partnership, the fight with the mining company. Yes. Thomas's whoop of delight might have been heard in the next county, and his immediate leap into Samuel's arms confirmed that at least one member of their family had no reservations about the sudden transformation of their circumstances. The celebration was cut short by the sound of approaching horses. Through the kitchen window, Margaret could see Caldwell and his mining company associates returning for what they clearly expected to be a routine business transaction. "Are you ready for this?" Samuel asked, his arm still around Thomas while his free hand found Margaret's. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," she replied, and was surprised to discover she meant it completely. They walked together to the front door, presenting themselves as a unified family rather than isolated individuals. Margaret carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had found her footing, while Samuel's bearing showed none of the deference that had characterized his previous interactions with visitors. Thomas, positioned between them, radiated the happiness of a child whose world had suddenly become more secure rather than less. Caldwell's expression showed immediate concern at the change in dynamics. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Ridge, we're here to finalize the mineral rights transaction. I trust you've reached a decision." "We have," Margaret replied. "Mr. Ridge has sold his mineral rights to me for the sum of $1. I am now the legal owner of the deposits you're interested in, and I have no intention of selling them to your company." The lawyer's carefully prepared composure cracked visibly. "Mrs. Whitmore, that's highly irregular. We had an understanding—" "You had an assumption," Samuel interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made final decisions. "And assumptions aren't the same as agreements." Morrison, the mining company representative, stepped forward with the aggressive posture of someone accustomed to intimidating opposition. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're making a serious mistake. The legal precedents for mineral access rights are well established. We can obtain court orders that will allow us to proceed regardless of your cooperation. Then I suggest you get started on those court orders," Margaret replied calmly. "You'll find that fighting someone with adequate resources and competent legal representation is quite different from bullying isolated widows." The transformation in Margaret's demeanor, from uncertain woman seeking guidance to confident adversary prepared for battle, clearly caught the mining representatives off guard. They had expected to be negotiating with a vulnerable widow and a drifting ranch hand, not confronting a unified family with both emotional and legal grounds for resistance. "This isn't over," Morrison said, though his tone suggested more bluster. "Than confidence. I certainly hope not," Margaret agreed pleasantly. "I'm looking forward to a vigorous legal discussion about property rights, environmental impact, and corporate responsibility. I think the people of Montana will find it quite educational." As the lawyers departed with considerably less confidence than they had shown upon arrival, Margaret felt the last vestiges of uncertainty fall away. She had chosen her path not through careful calculation, but through emotional conviction, and the rightness of that choice seemed to radiate through every aspect of her being. Standing on her porch with Samuel's arm around her waist and Thomas chattering excitedly about wedding plans, Margaret realized that she had not just saved her ranch. She had discovered that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in protecting what you had, but in risking everything for the possibility of something better. The wedding ring that Samuel placed on Margaret's finger 3 weeks later was carved from mountain ash, its surface smooth as silk and marked with delicate engravings that caught the light like captured starfire. He had worked on it during the long evenings, while she handled the legal preparations for their fight against Consolidated Mining, each careful cut of his knife a meditation on the promises he was preparing to make. "I know it's not gold," he said as he slipped it onto her finger during the simple ceremony in their own parlor, "but ash wood is strong and flexible, like the best marriages. It bends without breaking, weathers storms without losing its essential nature." Margaret felt Tears prick her eyes as she examined the ring's intricate beauty. The pattern carved into its surface depicted intertwining vines that seemed to grow from the wood itself, creating a circle that appeared to have no beginning or end. Samuel's craftsmanship had transformed a simple piece of wood into something that rivaled any jewelry she had ever owned. "It's perfect," she whispered, meaning it completely. The ceremony itself was deliberately intimate, just themselves, Thomas serving as ring-bearer with grave importance, Mrs. Patterson and Tom Bradley as witnesses, and Reverend Matthews officiating, with the warmth of someone who had known Margaret through both her darkest and brightest moments. Dr. Harrison had made the journey from Helena specifically for the occasion, his presence representing not just friendship, but professional endorsement of the match's benefits for Thomas's continued development. "Do you, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, take Samuel Jonas Ridge to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Margaret looked into Samuel's eyes as she spoke her vows, seeing in them the same wonder she felt at their unlikely journey from strangers to partners. "I do, with all my heart." Samuel's own vows were delivered in the steady voice she had come to associate with his most serious promises. When he pledged to love and protect both her and Thomas for the rest of his life, Margaret heard in his words the echo of commitments made not just to her, but to the memory of a brother he had failed to save. This time, his voice suggested, he would get it right. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and thorough, conveying both passion and tenderness in a way that made Margaret feel simultaneously cherished and claimed. Thomas's enthusiastic applause broke the solemnity of the moment, his joy at their union evident in every aspect of his being. "Now you're really my papa," he announced to Samuel with satisfaction. "Not just pretend papa, but real papa." "Real papa," Samuel agreed solemnly, kneeling to Thomas's level. "Forever and always, no matter what." The reception that followed was simple but heartfelt. Mrs. Patterson had prepared Margaret's favorite foods. Tom Bradley produced a bottle of whiskey that Charles had been saving for special occasions, and Dr. Harrison regaled them with stories of frontier weddings he had attended over the years. The atmosphere was one of celebration, tempered by the practical awareness that their happiness had been hard-won and would need to be vigilantly protected. To Margaret and Samuel, Reverend Matthews offered as the evening's final toast, "May your marriage be a testament to the truth that love is stronger than fear, and that family is defined not by blood alone, but by the choice to care for one another through all of life's challenges." Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Thomas had been settled in his bed with his wooden animals arranged in careful order around him, Margaret and Samuel found themselves alone in the parlor where they had shared so many conversations over the preceding months. The room felt different now, not just a space where they had grown to know each other, but the beginning of a home they would build together. "Are you sure about this?" Samuel asked, his question encompassing not just their marriage, but the fight against consolidated mining that would likely define the early years of their union. "It's not too late to change your mind, sell the ranch, move somewhere they can't follow." Margaret turned from the window where she had been watching the last light fade from the western mountains. In the lamplight, Samuel's face showed both hope and uncertainty, as if he still couldn't quite believe that someone would choose him over the easier path of compromise and retreat. "Samuel Jonas Ridge," she said, using his full name with the same gravity he had employed during their wedding vows. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. This ranch is Thomas's birthright and our future. No one is going to take it from us without the fight of their lives." Samuel's smile transformed his entire face, revealing depths of happiness that his years of wandering had hidden even from himself. "In that case, Mrs. Ridge, I think we should discuss our strategy for the legal battle ahead." The conversation that followed was both practical and intimate, Two people planning not just for immediate challenges, but for a lifetime of shared decisions and mutual support. They discussed the lawyers Margaret had hired from Denver, the environmental arguments they would present against the mining operation, and the community support they hoped to build among neighboring ranchers who would also be affected by large-scale mining activities. "The key," Samuel observed, "is making this about more than just our ranch. If we can show that consolidated mining threatens the entire valley's way of life, we'll have allies instead of fighting alone." Margaret nodded, already envisioning the broader coalition they might build. "Tom Bradley says the Kellys and the Washingtons have been approached by mining scouts. If we can organize a unified response before they start picking us off one by one." Their planning was interrupted by a soft knock at the parlor door. Thomas appeared in his nightgown, his expression showing the uncertainty that sometimes accompanied his nighttime wakings since his illness. "I had the dream again," he said simply. "The one where people take our house away and we have to live somewhere else." Margaret's heart clenched at the evidence that Thomas understood more about their situation than she had realized. His fear of displacement, expressed through recurring nightmares, showed that her son's emotional intelligence extended to awareness of threats he couldn't fully articulate. Samuel stood immediately, opening his arms to welcome Thomas into the circle of safety that marriage had formalized. "Come here, son. Let's talk about that dream." As Thomas settled between them on the sofa, Margaret marveled at how naturally Samuel had assumed the role of father, how completely her son accepted his presence in that capacity. The transition from hired hand to husband and stepfather had occurred without artifice or awkwardness, as if their family had simply grown to accommodate the love that had been building among them for months. "Dreams about losing your home are scary," Samuel said seriously, treating Thomas's fears with the respect he accorded all the boys' concerns. "But dreams aren't the same as real life. In real life, your mama and I are going to make sure this ranch stays in our family forever, even if the bad men try to take it." "Especially if the bad men try to take it," Samuel replied firmly. "Sometimes protecting the things you love means standing up to people who think they can take whatever they want. Your Papa Charles built something strong here, and we're going to keep it strong." Thomas considered this explanation with the serious attention he brought to important information. "Will you teach me how to help protect our house?" "When you're older, absolutely," Samuel promised. "But right now, the best way you can help is by being brave and trusting that the grown-ups who love you know how to handle grown-up problems." They walked Thomas back to his bedroom and settled him under his covers. Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. Their family might face external challenges, but internally they had achieved something rare and precious. A unity based on genuine affection rather than social convention or economic necessity. Standing in Thomas's doorway with Samuel's arm around her waist, Margaret watched her son arrange his wooden animals in their protective circle around his pillow. The ritual that had once seemed like childhood regression now appeared as wisdom. Thomas understood that safety came not from isolation, but from surrounding yourself with those who cared enough to stand guard while you slept. "Sweet dreams," she whispered, knowing that tonight's dreams would likely be peaceful ones. "Night, Mama." "Night, Papa Samuel," Thomas replied, his voice already heavy with approaching sleep, as they walked to their own bedroom, the master suite, that Margaret had not shared with anyone since Charles's death. She felt the significance of the moment settling around them like a blessing. Marriage to Samuel represented not just personal happiness, but the completion of a family unit that could weather whatever storms the future might bring. The wooden ring on her finger caught the lamplight as she prepared for bed, its carved vines seeming to pulse with life of their own. Samuel's gift represented more than symbol or ornament. It was a promise carved from living wood, a circle of protection that would grow stronger with age rather than weaker. Outside their bedroom window, the Montana night stretched endlessly above the ranch that was now truly their shared home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in their fight against consolidated mining, but tonight belonged to the quiet joy of a family finally complete, bound together by choices made in love rather than necessity. As Margaret settled into Samuel's arms for their first night as husband and wife, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through dramatic battles, but through the simple courage to choose love over fear, to risk everything for the possibility of building something better than what came before. 2 years later, Margaret stood on the same front porch where she had first watched Samuel approach the ranch, but now she was not alone. Thomas, grown taller and stronger, leaned against the railing beside her, his wooden animals long since replaced by more sophisticated interests, but his essential gentleness unchanged. Samuel emerged from the barn where he had been tending to, a mare in foal, his movements showing the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. The legal battle with consolidated mining had been won 6 months earlier, their victory coming not through dramatic courtroom confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence, allies, and public support that had eventually made the mining operation politically and financially untenable. The company had withdrawn their claim with considerable legal posturing, but evident relief at escaping what had become a public relations nightmare. "The photographer should be here soon," Margaret called to Samuel as he approached the house. "Mrs. Patterson wants to make sure we're all properly arranged before he starts taking pictures." The family portrait had been Samuel's idea, a formal documentation of their transformed life to replace the photograph of Margaret and Charles that had dominated the parlor for so many years. The earlier picture would not be discarded, but moved to a place of honor in Thomas's room, where it belonged as part of his heritage rather than a shrine to a life that could no longer grow. "Thomas, go wash your hands and find your good shirt," Margaret instructed. "We want to look our best for posterity." As Thomas hurried inside to prepare, Samuel joined Margaret on the porch, his arms settling around her waist with the natural ease of long habit. The wooden ring on her finger had grown smoother with wear, its carved vines seeming to deepen in character as the wood aged and absorbed the oils from her skin. "Any word from the Kellys about the irrigation project?" Samuel asked, referring to the cooperative venture they had organized among neighboring ranchers to improve water management across the valley. "Tom says they're ready to begin construction next month," Margaret replied. "The drought this summer convinced everyone that we need better water security if we're going to keep our ranches viable for the next generation." Samuel nodded, his expression showing satisfaction at the collaborative spirit that had emerged from their fight against the mining company. What had begun as a desperate alliance to resist outside exploitation had evolved into a genuine community of mutual support and shared planning. "Speaking of the next generation," Samuel said with a smile that suggested carefully harbored news, "Dr. Harrison's examination yesterday confirmed what we suspected. Thomas is going to be a big brother come spring." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, where new life was beginning its journey toward the world. At 40, she had not expected to bear another child, but Samuel's gentle persistence about expanding their family had gradually overcome her concerns about age and Thomas's reaction to potential competition for attention. "How did Thomas take the news?" she asked, though his enthusiastic chatter that morning had already suggested positive reception. "He's already planning how to teach the baby about horses and cattle counting," Samuel chuckled. "I think he sees himself as the expert big brother who'll show a younger sibling all the important ranch skills." The sound of an approaching wagon announced the photographer's arrival. Mr. Harrison Phelps from Helena had gained a reputation for capturing family portraits that revealed character rather than merely recording appearance, and Margaret had specifically requested his services for this important documentation. As they gathered in the parlor for the formal sitting, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. The room that had once echoed with too much space and too little laughter now hummed with the comfortable activity of a thriving family. Thomas positioned himself between his parents with natural ease, while Samuel's bearing showed none of the hesitation that had characterized his early months at the ranch. "Now then," Mr. Phelps said, adjusting his equipment with professional precision, "I want this portrait to capture not just how you look but who you are as a family. Mrs. Ridge, if you could rest your hand on your husband's shoulder." "Yes, that's perfect." Mr. Ridge, turn slightly toward your wife while keeping your other hand on Thomas's shoulder. "And Master Thomas, you can hold whatever you'd like to include in the picture." Thomas immediately reached for the music box that remained his most treasured possession, its silver surface now showing the gentle wear of years of careful handling. The artifact that had once represented his only connection to his father now served as a bridge between past and present, honoring memory while embracing new love. "Excellent," the photographer murmured, making final adjustments to lighting and composition. "I can see the genuine affection among you. That's what makes a portrait truly memorable. When the love is real, it shows in every line of the image." As the photographer worked, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a woman isolated by grief and protectiveness, building walls around herself and Thomas in the mistaken belief that safety lay in separation. Samuel's arrival had challenged every assumption she had made about love, trust, and the possibility of second chances. The battle with Consolidated Mining had tested their new unity, but ultimately strengthened it, proving that their marriage could withstand external pressure while maintaining internal harmony. More importantly, it had established them as leaders in their community rather than isolated outliers, creating networks of friendship and mutual support that enriched their daily lives. "One more pose," Mr. Phelps requested. "This time, I'd like you to look at each other rather than at the camera. Let me capture the way you see one another." Margaret turned to meet Samuel's eyes, finding in them the same wonder and gratitude she felt about their unlikely path to happiness. His face, weathered by years of outdoor work but softened by contentment, reflected a man who had found peace after decades of restless searching. Thomas, observing the exchange between his parents, smiled with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had never doubted that love could multiply rather than divide, that new affection could coexist with cherished memories. "Perfect," the photographer announced with satisfaction. "These will be portraits your grandchildren will treasure." After Mr. Phelps departed with promises to deliver the finished photographs within a fortnight, the family settled into their evening routine. Thomas worked on his lessons. His progress had continued steadily, and Dr. Harrison now predicted that he would achieve functional independence as an adult, though he would always require some support and guidance. "Samuel," Thomas said as they reviewed his arithmetic homework, "when the baby comes, will you teach it to carve animals like you taught me?" Over the past year, Samuel had begun instructing Thomas in basic woodworking, adapting his techniques to accommodate his stepson's limitations, while building the boy's confidence in his ability to create beautiful objects with his own hands. "If the baby wants to learn," Samuel replied, "but first we'll have to wait for little hands to grow big enough to hold carving tools safely." "I could help teach," Thomas offered eagerly. "I know how to make horses and cows now. I could show the baby the easy things while you do the hard parts." Margaret listened to their planning with a heart full of gratitude for the simple miracle of a child who saw himself as capable of nurturing others rather than only needing care. Thomas's growth under Samuel's patient guidance had exceeded every prediction, proving that limitations need not define possibilities when love provided the foundation for development. As the evening progressed and Thomas was settled for the night, Margaret and Samuel found themselves in the garden behind the house, walking among the vegetables and flowers that had flourished under Mrs. Patterson's careful tending. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked as they paused beside the rose bushes Charles had planted for their first anniversary. "Giving up the wandering life for all this domesticity?" Samuel considered the question seriously as he did all her inquiries about his happiness. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of having no responsibilities beyond keeping myself fed and sheltered," he admitted. "But then I remember what that simplicity cost. No one to care if I lived or died. No purpose beyond mere survival. No legacy to leave behind." He gestured toward the house where warm light spilled from the windows onto the porch where they had shared so many conversations. "This is messy and complicated and sometimes overwhelming, but it's also real in ways that solitude never was. I matter here. My choices affect people I love. That's worth any amount of complication." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Her own journey from isolated widow to wife, mother, and community leader had involved similar trade-offs. The loss of simple certainty in exchange for the complex richness of interconnected lives. "The baby will be born into all this," she said, her hand resting on her stomach where new life was taking shape. "No memory of the time before we were a complete family." "Maybe that's a blessing," Samuel suggested. "This child will never know that families can be broken, only that they can grow. There's something to be said for that kind of innocent confidence." As they walked back toward the house, Margaret felt the profound satisfaction of a woman who had chosen correctly when choice seemed impossible. The ranch that had once felt too large and too quiet now hummed with appropriate activity, the sounds of a working operation managed by people who understood both its practical requirements and its deeper significance as a legacy for future generations. The porch light beckoned them home to a house where Thomas slept peacefully surrounded by his carved animals, where Mrs. Patterson had left evidence of tomorrow's preparations in the spotless kitchen, where their own bedroom awaited with the promise of continued intimacy and shared dreams. Standing in her doorway for a moment before entering, Margaret looked back across the valley where other ranch lights twinkled in the darkness, each one representing families who had chosen to stay and build rather than sell and retreat. The community they had helped forge would endure long after they were gone, a network of mutual support that honored the best traditions of frontier life while adapting to changing circumstances. Samuel's arm around her waist, the child growing. Within her, Thomas's contented sleep upstairs. All of it testified to the truth that love was indeed stronger than fear, that families could be rebuilt even after devastating loss, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in protecting what you had, but in risking everything for the possibility of something better. The music box's melody drifted faintly from Thomas's room as its spring wound down for the night, playing the same tune that had comforted him through his darkest hours, but now serving as a lullaby for dreams filled with possibility rather than fear. Margaret smiled at the sound, recognizing in it the perfect metaphor for their transformed life, something precious from the past that continued to bring joy while making room for new sources of happiness. As she prepared for sleep beside the man who had taught her that love could indeed find you when you least expected it, Margaret carried with her the certainty that their story was just beginning. The ranch would continue to thrive, Thomas would grow into his full potential, the new baby would bring fresh joy to their lives, and the community they had helped build would provide security and fellowship for generations yet unborn. Outside, their bedroom window, the Montana sky stretched endlessly above land that would remain in their family's hands, protected not just by legal documents, but by the bonds of love that had proven stronger than any force that had tried to break them. In the morning there would be new challenges and fresh opportunities, but tonight belonged to the quiet satisfaction of a family complete, a legacy secured, and a love that had transformed strangers into something far more precious: home.